serious. I want to be effective.
You said you are obsessive about build-up play. In order to get results, would you sacrifice that at all?
Impossible. It's impossible. When you sacrifice for one reason, when you lose a game, if you believe in that, you have to keep going. So when it's going to happen, you're going to use the goalkeeper, going to wrong pass, and you're going to receive a goal. And the people say, why you don't hit ball? No, we have to insist on that. The reason why you miss that pass.
So you wouldn't what we call win ugly.
You say that, or we've read that you say that you only really stay anywhere for 3 or 4 years. Do you intend to build a legacy here, or at least put the foundations in place?
I came to learn.
You come to learn?
Yeah, of course. That's why I move on. I came to learn. You know, I will be still in Barcelona.
Welcome to another episode of Between the Post. My name is Tyler Vaughn, I'm your host, and Between the Post episodes are all about inspiration, education, and motivation to help you, the coach, player, parent, or fan, be a better version of yourself on the pitch. Again, my name is Tyler Vaughn, and this is a podcast devoted to goalkeepers and coaches, bringing you the most relevant topics, challenges that you might be facing every single week. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a veteran coach or a new coach. We really strive to deliver a variety of topics and also strategies for each of you. Now, we know this tends to be a podcast for goalkeepers, but often we find ourselves tackling coach-related topics that could help the team coach as well as the goalkeeper coach. And that's no secret today in our episode with our guest that is not necessarily new to the show, but for those of you new listeners, he is going to be new to you, and I guarantee you he is not to be missed. His name is Karl Dawazian. Koach Karl comes to us from California, where he was previously the state director of not goalkeeping, rather. He might hurt me if I say that out loud, but he was the state director for the California Youth Soccer Association for some 35 years. He developed a book that was titled Fundamental Soccer, the 9-Step Practice Routine, from essentially what was a round table with many other coaches over decades of his experience doing a variety of clinics as a clinician for California Youth Soccer and many other different organizations throughout the United States. He, by far, is probably one of the leading coach educators, in my opinion, from the conversations I've had in the years that I've coached. The education flows off his tongue, and again, if that sounds weird to you and you haven't listened to Koach Karl, he is going to take you through a whirlwind of an experience today. He's really going to offer up in this particular episode, and as he does so very well, if you potentially haven't listened to any of Koach Karl's episodes here on Between the Post, he was on episodes 8 through 12. We did a mini-series on the 9-step practice routine, and let me tell you, Koach Karl put me in the most uncomfortable situations as a coach that I have been in quite some time, and I could not thank him more for that. You know, it's a very unique thing as a coach whenever we look at reflecting on our past experiences or what we are currently doing potentially out there on the fields at the small associations, the large clubs, the established clubs, the new clubs, wherever you really might be in the soccer spectrum out there in the United States right now, and even globally. You know, there are questions that need answers to, and obviously this is a time of reflection. All of the guests that I have on, they're a part of that reflection, and we all, for the most part, agree that we want to be a part of the solution to improving youth soccer in the United States as opposed to being a part of the problem, which is actually where Between the Post was born. It was born out of the ideal that this is a platform for coaches, a platform for parents. As we mentioned in the intro, it is an opportunity for voices to get out there and hopefully for voices like Koach Karl's to be heard to many, many people. Our goal is to help one coach, and really under the opinion that if we help one coach, we know that hopefully we're helping 15 players, and those 15 players one day could potentially help 15 more as they become coaches in the next generation of soccer players. Koach Karl is by far doing that. I am humbled every time I speak with him. He, again, puts me in situations where I'm thinking. I'm reflecting on what I've seen the past week, what I might have done the past month, and potentially how I can go out to the next training session and improve myself and those around me. Coach Karl, obviously, as you listen to him talk and as you listen to him question, he embodies the true essence of a teacher. And I think that for sure, one of the things we're lacking out there in a lot of different areas through coaching is that teacher-educator mentality. We'll touch on that a little bit in today's episode, but today's episode comes to us. We wanted to dive in. Coach Karl and I, we reflected on the mini-series that we did, and it was phenomenal, funny, fantastic. We hope it was high level. That was what we were doing, but we wanted high level with simplicity. We both agree that, unfortunately, in some cases, soccer and coaching education has become overly complicated, and we wanted to simplify coaching education. And obviously, certain topics that we know can and will improve the current and next generation of soccer players in the United States. And we think that small-sided games, as we reflected back on the mini-series, we wanted to pull that out. We do agree, and we felt that obviously it is a hot topic right now. It is certainly a topic that deserved a little more attention from the podcast that we previously recorded, the mini episodes, in particular, maybe a couple of the episodes in the mini-series that we did previously, episodes 8 through 12 on Between the Post, and therefore we are going to deliver that in-depth view. We're taking it out again of the 9-step practice routine. If you are unfamiliar with Coach Karl and obviously unfamiliar with fundamental soccer or the 9-step practice routine, I really highly encourage you to take a quick look, pause it right now. Maybe if you pause it, you won't come back, so maybe that's not very good in terms of selling the podcast, but at some point, please do go ahead and take a look over at fundamentalsoccer.com. Coach Karl does a wonderful job of posting blogs, writing blogs. He is often featured on many blogs throughout the United States at a high level from a coaching perspective, and again, works in a network of coaches that I can tell you one thing, their resumes are miles long, including Coach Karl's, who again, we are extremely fortunate and humbled to have on the show today. We'll turn it over to the episode here. Again, we're diving into small-sided games with Coach Karl Dawazian, former. It sounds a little bad to say former because I think that frankly he would rather be referred to as an advocate for youth and the youth soccer program, hopefully supporting the growth of youth so that the next generation of players and the current generation of soccer players has fun on the pitch. Coach Karl Dawazian diving back into small-sided games on Between the Post. This is another episode of Between the Post. We have a wonderful guest back on, Mr. Karl Dawazian, who has become a very good friend of mine, I'm pleased to say, and I'm humbled to hopefully be able to call you a good friend and definitely look up and respect the conversations we've had and the knowledge you possess and bring to the table. Thank goodness someone is going to bring something to the team here, because if it's left up to me, I'm not sure what would happen to the show. But welcome back, Karl.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And Karl, you are fresh off. We were talking off air before we began today. You are fresh off of a world travels to the beautiful country of Spain, and I know we don't have to dig into it too far because then it'll be a Travel Channel show, which could work out well for us. Who knows? But we've got you back, and we're looking forward to having you on today. And today's topic, small-sided games. So Karl can get into it. You can get into it a little bit more, obviously, but we previously did episodes 8 through 12, and we went through the Fundamental Soccer Practice, which is a book that Karl has developed with many friends I know around kind of round tables in the state of California over the many years. We will not say how many, but enough to not have to mention them, right? At the state director level for California Youth Soccer Association, Karl's got a wonderful book, looking at it right now, as a matter of fact, the 9-step practice routine, and it is really wonderful. And if you want to take a look or listen rather to the 9 steps and our conversations on that, that's back in episodes 8 through 12, a mini-series we did. But we knew that we wanted to dive, and Karl, you brought up such a fair point a few weeks back about diving deeper into small-sided games. As I mentioned, the NSCAA, the United Soccer Coaches, they have out a relatively newer small-sided diploma. So there's a lot of buzz about small-sided games, and I think it's something that deserves a deeper conversation and a deeper look, especially with someone of your caliber from a coaching standpoint. And I know that that's something we're both excited to kind of dive into for different reasons. And we know that hopefully for the listeners out there, this is going to be an episode full of knowledge, full of feedback on small-sided games, philosophies, tactics, and approaches on how you could, at any level you're coaching, with any age player, how you can hopefully bring small-sided games into the training sessions that you're working on, creating game-like scenarios for players that really just enable exponential player development and growth. Small-sided games will go into some of the things that are going on out there in the conversations, globally speaking. But for us here, we want to get into it. And I know, Carl, your main goal is, as we did last time, is to ask me as many questions as you can that stump me up and prove to the listeners out there that I've never kicked a soccer ball in my life. Is that the right? Do I have it right there?
Well, let's get it started. My first question, Tyler, to you is: what is the smallest number of players on the field in a small-sided game?
Total players? Is it
total number of players? What's the smallest that you can put on the field and make it a small-sided game?
Well, I would assume this is a trick question, so it's probably 2, which is a 1v1. I'm assuming. Is that correct?
Okay, so this is the answer that I get in almost every single course that I've taught throughout the last 30-some years.
So you stumped me then.
What people need to understand is that the word is small-sided, which means plural. That means more players than one player per team. And there's 2 games that are absolutely necessary in every single practice. One of them is the 1 versus 1. We start with the 1+1. And the other one is the scrimmage. So coaches need to make sure that you always have the 1 versus 1 games in the first half of the practice and the scrimmage in the second half of the practice. And then we get to the small-sided games, which means a plural, which means at least 2 players on one team. So here's my next question. What's the smallest number of players that you can have on a small-sided game?
4. Total.
2.
2v2. 2 plus 2.
2 players.
Yeah.
2 players versus 0 players.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, so that's great. We're starting out this episode about like the last ones we did. And just for the record, for the listeners out there, I do know what a soccer ball looks like.
Well, you might be good at soccer, but your math isn't too good.
That's right. Fair enough. I respect that. I do respect that.
All right, so we're with the 2 players plus 0 players. But before we get started with that particular game, what's the most important thing that you have to teach these players prior to playing the 2 plus 0 game? Okay, remember what we talked about is that we play the 2 plus, and the plus stands for players learn using stoppages, or the coach is going to add information in this particular game. In other words, when we play the game and we have player or coaches stop the players, what they're doing is they're stopping their education. Anytime that you stop the players, when the ball stops and the player stops, I believe that learning stops.
Right.
So you have to have a moment or a game where there are stoppages. So to go back to what we did a few weeks ago, if I were to say, as you're playing a small-sided game, and all I said was, Tyler, what would be your very first response?
So I would probably be thinking, what did I do wrong?
Okay, so what did you do wrong? And mentally what you're doing is you're putting up a barrier and you are not ready to be educated.
Mm-hmm.
So in the plus games, what we need to do is let the kids know we will be stopping you. It's a positive time because 1, I know your name. 2, I'm going to improve you as a player.
Right.
And that means that you want some kind of a physical response by the players during the plus game, some kind of a physical response that tells you that the player understands that they're open for information. And you might ask them to, it would be Tyler, you would smile at the coach. It would be Tyler, give the coach a peace signal, whatever it might be, hit 3 times on the chest, jump 3 times in the air. You're telling the coach that I don't feel like I'm being picked on, I don't feel like I did anything wrong. My peers don't feel like, here I screwed up again. So during the plus games, the end result is that we're going to be making sure that the player understands we're going to make them a little bit better. Does that make sense to you so far?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so now before we start the game, there's something that's extremely important, and most coaches don't do it. But before the 2+0 game starts, what do you think I'm going to ask the players to do?
Is it just observe the environment that they're playing in? Observe the area they have?
Very good. Rather than observe the environment, they need to lay out the environment.
Oh, that's right. Getting back into the player created. Okay. Yeah, gotcha.
Have to make the players responsible for their playing environment in practice, so that hopefully from practice someday when they're at home or in the park or at school, they'll be able to lay out that same environment and start playing the game when the coach is not around. So with 2+0 players, how far apart will the goals be? Not the size of the goals, but how far apart distance-wise, the length of the field, how long should the field be when you have 2 players plus 0 players?
I want to say 20 by 20, but that sounds too big, and I think you're going to disagree with me, so I'll still stick with 20 by 20.
It's you're finally correct, because 2 players plus 10 yards equals 20 yards. So
right.
The length of the field is 20 yards to start off with.
Perfect.
Let's go back to the formula one more time, in case some of the coaches didn't catch this.
In case they didn't listen the first time around, when this was where you stumped me on the mathematical portion of the podcast here. I do remember that.
Right, and I'm not trying to get you on the mathematical portion. I'm trying to get the coaches to understand that we need to teach the players to lay out their own environment. Otherwise, the only time they'll play soccer is when you're around and you're laying out everything.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, so the formula one more time is the larger team times 10 yards. What's the reason for that formula? Okay, it's because the adult field, is 110 yards long. We have 11 players, which equals to 10 yards per player.
Mm-hmm.
Or with the younger kids, it's 10 steps per player. So if we had a game of 4 players on one team versus 3 players, the field or the goals are 40 yards apart.
Right.
6 plus 1, it would be 60 yards apart. And the other one that we mentioned earlier is the 1+1 or 1 versus 1. They're automatically 10 yards apart. Now the coach can obviously make those yardages and spaces larger or smaller depending on what their theme is, but that would be the foundation for laying out the environment.
Right. Now that's a wonderful point that you're bringing in, and I remember that from our previous conversations, and I know that we dove into it a little bit then, and we can just touch back on that topic of the creating the space in the environment. There are a lot of times where we either provide way too much space that it's unrealistic, or we provide way too small of an area to where it is not game like, and it really provides a rather impossible situation or game for the players to perform in. So I think that is, if you learn anything and take anything from the first little bit here of this episode, I think for that one is an immediate impact that coaches can make into making sure we're sizing our fields and our spaces appropriately. And the thing that you touch on that I love, and again, it reminds me of past conversations back episodes 8 through 12 when we were diving into this, it's the time that players spend playing soccer. And if we don't start doing something different about teaching players how to set up their own and create their own environment, then how can we expect them to understand how to play outside of the practice field? So I definitely love that you brought that to the forefront. That's definitely a little nugget of information that is good to think through and good to remember. So thank you for bringing that back to the front.
You're very welcome. And the reason that I try to bring that up all the time is because you need to take a look at where do most of the world-class players come from? They come from other countries except the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And where did those kids in their U6s through U12 age groups, where did they play? In the streets, there's no one laying out the environment for them, and yet they become world-class players.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got our American kids who come to practices, everything's laid out for them, and they don't know what to do once an adult is not around to lay out the environment for them. So I think what we need to do is change our approach a little bit and teach these kids how to lay out their own environment before they start playing, especially the 1 versus 1, and then what we're going to be talking about, the small-sided games.
Right. That's wonderful. That little nugget of how to space based on the largest number on the teams I hope people are writing that down, because whether we all want to admit it or not, that's probably one of the bigger struggles for beginning coaches out there, is just understanding how to structure the space on the field appropriately. So thank you for saying that again. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So we started out with the numbers. There's 2 plus 0. We talked about the plus, meaning that there's going to be stoppages, and the player is not going to be offended or caught being caught making a mistake. And so let's get away from the numbers. Let's get away from what the numbers are, and let's talk about what the numbers should be. Mm-hmm. If I were to play 1 plus 1, 1 plus 1, a 1 versus 1 game, what theme or what technique is not going to be learned?
Passing.
Okay, so when you play 1 plus 1 or 1 versus 1, there is no passing, and yet almost all coaches set up games for passing with even-sided numbers. Mm-hmm. Well, if you've got 2 plus 2, 3 plus 3, 4 plus 4, 5 plus 5, all you have is the 1 plus 1 game expanded. So if your theme is going to be passing, please make sure that you have uneven-sided games. That means that you need to start with the number of players that are going to be on the field on Saturday, which in the younger age groups right now are 4 aside. And how many players do you think I would want them to oppose if they were starting to learn how to pass the ball? We've got 4 players on one team. By the way, how far apart are the goals going to be?
40.
Excellent.
Yes, I'm learning. I'm telling you what. It's only taken, how many episodes have we done together? I did want to lead with this. I'm a bit of a slow learner, so I apologize for that. But no, so obviously 40 yards, 4 being the larger, the attacking side, focused in on the passing, which you'd mentioned. So you'd ask me how many players would be opposing it. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and that's my role. I would want to say that it's 1.
Remember, what you need in order to have the player learn how to pass the ball correctly is what? Lots of repetition.
Right.
You have an opponent out there and they're just beginning to learn, and let's say that they're out there and constantly that opponent's taking the ball away, what kind of confidence do you think they'll have in their passing ability? We've got 4 of us out here and 1 out there who's constantly taking the ball away. I don't think my confidence is going to be built that much. So I suggest that you start out 40 yards apart, 4 players plus 0.
Right.
Players on the opposing team.
And not to interrupt, but to add to the point you just made, which is our confidence as adults, we could put it in perspective, right? We would understand that, well, hey, listen, 4v1 and we can't keep the ball. That's just plain poor to begin with. But when we're talking 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, it's a different environment and a different feeling and a different emotion for a young athlete and a young player to experience that failure. So yes, I definitely agree with that, and I wanted to point that out because I think that is obviously something we're forgetting a little bit, the bigger picture here, which is from an adult perspective, we can all just say out loud that's pretty bad if we can't possess a ball against one defender, right? But from an 8-year-old's perspective, there's no gray area. It's I can either do it or I can't, and if I can't do it, that's upsetting. So just to add that little tidbit in there to remind people what we're really talking about.
Well, Tyler, I'm sorry to add this to it. You went from 6 to 8-year-olds. I have coached high school players.
Same.
Who could not get past that one player.
Same.
So what we need to do is take a look at the skill level of the players and put the appropriate number of opponents on that field. In this case, we're 40 yards apart on the field. We've got 4 players. But in order for them to learn how to pass the ball, you also need to apply the 2-touch rule.
Right.
Which
Okay.
means that each player can only touch the ball twice. And that doesn't mean one time going down the field. It means when the ball is passed to a player, he must touch the ball first as to control it. The second one is to release it.
Right.
So what we're doing is every player must touch the ball, and everybody goes, well, against 0, what's the competition? Well, the competition is time, and also, as they get older, running patterns, because the player with the ball needs support up front, to the right or left side, and behind. Mm-hmm. So once the player passes the ball to another player, they need to move into the appropriate space.
Yep. And again, just to kind of add to that topic, when you're talking running patterns, we could be talking also about passing patterns as well. We're kind of talking the same thing. Is that correct? Kind of like a wall, integrating wall passes and tiered exercises or games rather. You know the word I stuck clear of just for you. But that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about integrating some passing patterns, I guess, to some extent, depending upon the level of player. Is that right?
Depends on the skill level and what the theme for the coach is.
Right.
It could
Okay.
be combination plays. It could be overlap runs. It could be simply, going back to the very young kids, teach them how to pass the ball correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you pass it behind the opponent? Do you pass it in front of it? Do you pass it to the right foot? Do you pass it to the left foot? Do you pass it hard? Do you pass it soft? Do you pass it to space? I mean, there are so many things that are involved in just passing that, we can't say, immediately put an opponent out there, even if you've got 4 players on the field.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. That's wonderfully said, and I couldn't be clearer on it. And it's kind of got, what it's got me. What the pauses aren't lack of focus, of course. The pauses are just thinking through from a level of what are we doing with these players right now, and I'm just kind of comparing it to things I've seen recently and things that I've heard, but no, so this I might be getting ahead, but I want to touch on this from the coaching perspective, and you're probably going to get into it. When we do these would you call this a 4+0 or 4v0? What did you call it again? I know there's
you always have to start with 4+.
Plus. Okay. So for the 4+0, from a coaching perspective, this is the opportunity for I know the plus stands for players learn using stoppages, correct?
Yes.
And again, I want to add that this is the part or the portion of the small-sided games that coaches are coaching through stoppages, correct?
This is the time where the coach actually talks to the players. The players know that they're going to improve because the coach is going to talk to them. Uneven games, to me, are strictly to improve the passing. And we haven't talked about this yet, but the other games that are the even games. And even means that both teams are equal. And now what you're working on, or you might be working on, are combination plays.
Okay, understood. Gotcha. So it was more a piece of the bigger picture that we were kind of talking about earlier. So again, I think we're just thinking through it. Maybe I was thinking a little bit too deep, but no, nonetheless. So yeah, go ahead, carry on. I apologize for interrupting.
No, I'm glad you did interrupt, because there's usually a very big confusion amongst at least youth coaches, where they don't understand, should they be playing uneven numbers or should they play with even number teams when they play small-sided games? And I think what I'm trying to point out is that if it's uneven-sided, then what you're usually working on is passing. Once you're into the even-sided games, you're working on all the other techniques.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. No, understood.
I'm not sure. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, absolutely it does, and I definitely agree with you that that decision from a coaching perspective is definitely potentially one that challenges a lot of us in understanding what the appropriate setup is from a player balance, or rather, if we're trying to create an unbalance, to work on what you're talking about, which is passing. So no, it absolutely is crystal clear, and I think that it was a great explanation of a topic that is certainly hopefully helpful to those listening.
Well, I think one of the reasons I'm trying to really overemphasize this point is because I know, or for years now, I go to the sidelines, you hear the parents as well as the coaches yelling, pass the ball, pass the ball. But if the children or the players aren't used to being able to set up a pass, which means that they push it a little bit forward, they have to see the field of play and then figure out, is this going to be a pass to space? Is it going to be to the feet? Is it going to be a soft pass? Unless they understand all of that, I don't think that they should be yelling and screaming, pass the ball.
Right. I also think that and we don't have to dive too deep into that rabbit hole because obviously they're. I'm sure we both have thoughts from many years combined of examples of that. But I think it also prevents the player from making decisions themselves as well because they're being influenced by outside, whether it's coaches or parents or people who they probably view at the younger ages in particular. I don't know why I keep coming back to the younger ages. I guess maybe I'm kind of in that zone of thinking how we can start at the foundation of the youth game and build for the future. But obviously you're right. There are these same exact issues going on at the high school and collegiate level and beyond, unfortunately, to some extent. So I think that we're doing what you started this whole conversation out with, which is getting players to be comfortable creating their own environment. We also have to be thinking about we need players comfortable in making their own decisions as well. Did that tie together appropriately? Like I was trying to get the words out from my brain.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
We need the confident players who don't get input from the outside because
Right.
the outside doesn't see the field the way a player does.
Right.
The player sees goal to goal, where the sideline sees touchline to touchline, and those are two different views. And in order for the player to make a decision, they need to face that kind of situation in practice. And
Right.
that's where we go back to start with 4 plus 0, and then you go to 4 versus 0. Well, what does the VS stand for?
So this one I do know, and it's the coach is verbally silent.
There you go. So now we've got 4 players playing against no players, and the coach is verbally silent. Where's the pressure come from? The coach needs to figure out, maybe it's time, maybe it's running patterns, maybe it's passes to accuracy of passes. And during that time, when the versus game starts, the coach should be taking notes of players who are not able to do what the coach is trying to teach.
Okay.
We taught them in the plus game, and now we test them during the versus game.
So, making sure I understand, and just probably making sure we clarify it more than anything. So we've gone from a 4 plus 0. So when we transition into a versus game, what would those numbers look like?
It still would be 0,
Okay.
4 players versus 0 players.
To start,
But
okay.
what we're looking for is speed of play, because
Right.
there's an opponent out there, and you could time them. You could take points away from them being inaccurate in their passing, in their running. And, I mean, there's so many things that are involved in this that the coach needs to figure out. What am I going to put down to teach them at the next practice? Or what can I not expect in the next game because they can't do it against no opponents?
Right. And essentially what you're saying is we're creating some competitive element when we get into the verses. Now, even if that's a 4 versus 0, we're implementing some type of competitive element that could potentially speed play up, or I'm assuming address a little more effectively the theme of that particular session. Is that correct?
Sure. As a matter of fact, let me give you an example of, let's say that you're playing a game of 4 versus 0, and the coach gives points for inaccurate passing to the 0 players. Actually keep score.
Right.
Or let's say the ball goes out of bounds, they lose 2 points. So what you're doing is the 0 players can make points from mistakes that the 4 players make against nobody because their passing is weak.
Right. So, Carl, I know that you have some thoughts on this, and I think that maybe we should, or I would love to hear your thoughts on it, I guess, rather, and remind me. We are playing to goals, correct, in the 4 versus 0. Is that correct?
Tyler, one of the most crucial things that I have found in this country is I think that any game or any activity that we have, unless it's warm-ups, that doesn't have a goal to attack and goal to defend, I think without those 2 objects, we're not playing soccer.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, and I definitely agree with you, and I thought that was the case, and I wanted to say I remembered that we talked about that before, but then again, so no, I mean I agree with you, right? Now remind me, because I love that you introduced how to set up the field. Remind me again, for those that didn't or haven't been able to listen to our other episodes. Remind me again, how do we have the players, which I know is a big piece of the puzzle here, so they're learning at the training sessions and they can do it at home. How do we have the players set up the goals? What was the method behind that?
Okay, obviously we can have small-sided goals,
Right.
already made by manufacturers, but I think that in the small-sided games in our practices, I like the use of cones.
Right.
And it's very important also for coaches to know that you can't just have orange cones out there because there will be several fields laid out. So you should have different colored cones or different colored flags or objects like cans or you name it to be laid out. But the way that they lay it out, because each age group, the size of the goal is going to be different. We start out with the feet together. We go to the right side as far as possible, stretching our leg out and putting the cone outside the right leg.
Right.
Coming back together and touching our toes with our hands with the object. Going to the left side and putting the cone or the object on the outside of the left foot. When you're finished with that, the end result is the size of the goal that's conducive to that age group.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I appreciate you diving and kind of adding in there that, because I definitely think, and I meant to ask you a little bit earlier and then we kept going on, but I wanted to come back to that because that's definitely important, because the size of the goal is extremely important, just as relevant as the size of the field that you've created and the space you've created for this particular game. So I wanted to touch on that. Now, another thing, and I'll play devil's advocate a little bit, not to disagree with you, but and this might not apply to 99% of the people listening today, but if it applies to the 1%, I'll feel good that we help that particular coach do something, make something a little bit easier. So if you're only stuck with orange cones, you're only stuck with one color cones, because I know it happens. I agree with you, Carl, 100%. You need some variety just from a visual standpoint for players because of whatever age groups we're working with. Let's help them out, right? Let's not confuse that situation. Well, hey coach, what goal's the goal again, right? So that whole thing, let's avoid that. That takes away from training. But for the coach that only has one color cone, I've done this in the past because I have been that coach that only had one color cone. Is I've taken two cones for the post of the goals that we just went through. How do we size that out correctly? And I've stacked two cones side by side, so it's a differentiator between all the other cones in the space. If you stack those two cones side by side, it's a kind of a visual differentiator if you've only got one color cone. So a little tidbit. That's what I bring to the table, I guess. Interesting cone displays, but no, like I said, for the coach that helps, obviously, hopefully that helps somebody out there for sure.
Well, I think that's a great idea. Never even thought of it. There's another thing that you can add also is instead of having the small-sided games adjacent to each other, lay them out in a checkerboard style so that you have one goal on top, one in the middle, and the other one on top again, so that the players can see that there are three games going on at the same time, but they're not adjacent to each other.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah, the other thing that's nice about that is that the coach can stand in the middle of the three games,
right?
Because there's no field in there, and he can observe all three games and figure out which one needs some help.
No, Carl, that's brilliant, actually, and that's from just purely, small-sided, we do want to talk, we are talking coaching education to some extent here, if not that's the total and complete focus of today's episode and conversation, but I think that we have to get away from, and I see it all the time, just because it's easier to lay a line of cones, every 5 yards, 10 yards, whatever you're setting up, and to create 15 different fields or channels all side by side. Let's get real here, right? That soccer ball is inevitably not going to stay in that small space or that large space or whatever it is. It's then going into an adjacent grid or an adjacent space, screwing up that particular game. And instead of impacting 6 players, 4 players, 5 players, we have now impacted 8 players, 10 players, 12 players, or whatever it might be. So again, something additional, but just thought process of how we lay stuff out. I think that's a good little side note to add in there for coaches who are thinking about how they're doing stuff out at their training sessions.
Well, let's go back to another side note, because in the 1 versus 1 or 1 plus 1, 1 versus 1, I like for the goals or the fields to be adjacent to each other. I like for the ball to go into other fields of play, because now the players have to make decisions and be creative on how do we get out of the situation and score on another goal. But once it comes to small-sided games, then I just don't think that it's very good to have the games adjacent to each other.
And is it more so probably your thought process if I'm assuming, which I don't like to do, but if I'm assuming, is Is it because that the whole purpose of a small-sided game is to introduce a more realistic version of the 1+1 and the 1 versus 1 and all the other build-up games that you've played leading up to that? Is that kind of what we're hitting on?
1+1, 1 versus 1 is the individual's
Right.
technique in what they're going to use in the small-sided game. And eventually, the small-sided game is a smaller portion of what's going to happen during the scrimmage or the regular game.
Right. Gotcha. But I meant, and that was probably my fault for explaining it poorly, but we're trying to maintain a more realistic atmosphere in the 4 versus 0, so it wouldn't be conducive, is my point, to having 3 soccer balls flying into the 4 versus 0 from other grids. That's all I was saying. So I think that we're kind of talking about the same thing for sure. So
I agree.
yeah, okay, good. I just, again, maybe a relevant topic for sure, but something I wanted to make sure we clear up for people out there that are truly going to take this stuff and use it in next week's sessions or tomorrow's sessions. So.
Sure. So now we've got one group that just flies through the 4+0, and they fly through the 4 versus 0. What do you think you're going to do at the next practice?
Add in a defensive player.
Excellent.
Yeah.
But only one.
Okay.
Only one, because again, the key to success is repetition, and they need to be able to repeat the passing over and over again. And one opponent, believe me, for a couple of practices is going to be very difficult to get by.
Right.
What if you have a group of individuals who still can do the 4+1 or 4+0? What do you do with them?
I'd imagine that you're going to keep them right where they are until they've mastered that particular game.
Gosh, you're a good coach, because the end result is you always need success.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want the kids to fail. We don't want the players to fail. They need to be successful in whatever you're teaching. But then we test them, and during the test, if they can't pass them, let them know. I'm sorry you didn't pass it. We're still back to this. When you go home, find your friends that you were playing with just now and practice this. And in passing, it might be up against the wall, both right and left foot.
Well, we touched on this in past episodes, like I said, so I don't mean to keep going back to it, but obviously for those that did listen in, and I want to tie some things back together just because it's been some time since we touched on these particular topics. But, I was listening to something the other day, and obviously my background's in education as a teacher, so I'm very fortunate that I think about things from potentially a different angle than some may be thinking about things. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but we look at the educational system, right? And I do fundamentally believe that every coach is a teacher, right? And then I think that you should just be a teacher, even if you're out on a soccer pitch or if you're in a classroom. I think that that's just me. And I think that will inevitably create better coaches as well if we come at it from that particular educational angle. But what I was listening to was somebody was talking. I forget exactly who it was on what podcast, but anyways, I was listening to something, and they said that think about the educational system in the United States, and they did say something from being in that system that I kind of agree with to an extent, that the educational system is flawed to a certain degree, and it does have some similarities in the game of soccer, and from a coaching perspective, that we have all of these standards in education that we hold students accountable to these standards, and unfortunately a lot of the standards are singular, where it's not necessarily the pass or fail mentality, but it is your own grade level if, right? And you're not if you're anything else. And we forget, and I think we're learning, specifically in education, not to go off topic, but I think we're also learning in soccer that we're learning that and remembering that we don't have the same player to the left, to the right, and in front of us. They're not identical. They're not learning the same way. They're not seeing the game the same. They're not developing the same speed as other players on the team. And I think that soccer and coaching specifically, we're learning and we're remembering that we can't just put drills out there, that bad word, or games for that matter too, but we can't put exercises, games, drills, whatever you decide to call it, for just one player, and then expect that every single player has to, it's not rise to the level, right? It's this is more than that. It's, pass or fail. If you can't do this today, well, sorry, we're going to move on. And though you can't do it, I'm going to throw you into a situation and an environment, which is what you're talking about, that you're not going to be able to succeed in. And if we're not creating success and we're not creating environments that build players' confidence, those are the players we're losing in the system, a year, 2 years down the road, because they're not having fun playing the game. So I know that's a bit of a side note tangent, but I listened to that the other day and it resonated with me, because I think that we need to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to coaching and to player development. And we as coaches, as leaders of the sport, trying to take, and you and I touch on this all the time, the only reason you and I speak on the phone and we do these podcasts, and frankly, the only reason that I budget time every week for these podcasts is because I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. And I know that you agree with me on that, and that's why we spend our time doing some of these things. And I know that's why you've devoted, I would probably say, your entire life to the game of soccer and to helping the youth.
Well, Tyler, I think what you just finished talking about, the best example is Michael Jordan. None of us know what the potential of any individual is, and if they're not successful, they'll quit. And
Right.
Fortunately, we have an example in Michael Jordan, who in high school got cut, and look at him. So, the bottom line is, let's not make these kids fail in anything at any time. If you find something, catch them at being good.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you might have to work a little bit harder to catch them at being good, to be fair. Right? I mean, you could look 9 out of 10 times, and they might be over there doing whatever they're doing, right? And it might be the complete opposite of what you would expect them to be doing. But it might not necessarily be because they're trying to do it the wrong way. It just might be because they're struggling at doing it the right way. So I think that this is one of the things that I know we do get into a little bit more of the philosophical side of things, but I think that right now that's what's needed. That is some of the information surrounding these wonderful topics like small-sided games and diving into the details of how coaches go about setting that up, why that's beneficial, why there's a lot of talk about small-sided games right now as it relates to the global soccer scene. I think that these little philosophical nuggets that we introduce, I think these are just so very important. Whether it supports the ideas of the coaches and the listeners and the parents who are listening to this already or need validation that they're on the right track. Hopefully that's some validation. Or whether it offers an opposing philosophy for the listener that's out there that may not agree with us. At least hopefully it's creating a conversation, whether it's internal or external, for sure. So.
Well, let's make sure that all kids stick around longer than they do today, because between the ages of 10 through 14, 75% of them quit.
Yep.
I think part of it has to do with exactly what you just finished talking about, which is that we do evaluate kids because of height, of strength, of abilities, that are more mature. Well, the child doesn't have any chance or any choice in how quickly they mature. So let's not eliminate them just because they're slow learners or they're slow at becoming big and fast.
Right. Yep.
So we talked about making sure that they understand that uneven-sided games are all about passing, and
Right.
even professional teams don't go 4 versus 4 with the coach having a theme of passing. They'll play 4-3. And now let's look at some of the options that you have, especially in the passing theme. You can have even-sided games on the field, but you can have neutral players on the outside, which makes the game uneven, and that means passing again. So you could have neutral players on the field itself, but they still have the 2-touch rule, or you can have players off the field with the 2-touch rule, and you can continue passing that way. So even though you have even-sided numbers, make sure you somehow create the environment where the other team or one of the teams has a numerical advantage, so that we find somebody that we can pass the ball to. Because again, repetition is the key to success, and once they repeat it enough times, hopefully it'll become instinctive.
No, that's great. I think that biggest takeaway from that piece that you just said there is the numerical advantage. When we talk uneven, you can achieve numerical advantage in so many different ways, whether that is in some type of advantage on wide players that are outside the particular space. Would you agree that, I know it's a numerical advantage, but what are your thoughts on having a neutral player inside as well, floating basically with the attacking team? Does that create chaos? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, it's up to the coach's ability to be able to control that environment, because we've experimented with having a neutral player on the attacking team. In most cases, it works. but we tried it with the defending team, and we have found a little success.
Right.
So not too sure if it's numerical advantage in the defending team, if that works, but if it does for the coach, then obviously do it. If it doesn't work, then let's try to figure out a different way of teaching the defending portion of the game in small-sided games.
Okay. Right. Good point. Good point for sure.
Okay, so you can also, because you mentioned flank players, and we're still talking about passing, you can also have a neutral zone on the field of play. If flank players, what you do is you take an area, you mark it out, and no defender can go inside of that particular section. That leaves the wing player outside to pass the ball, cross the ball, or whatever expectations you've got.
Perfect. No, perfect. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I thought you were going to keep going. No, I definitely agree with you there. And I know it's hard when we're just verbalizing this to try to paint the picture for coaches who might be listening, trying to figure out how they can take this. But obviously, resources-wise, Karl, I know you've got a lot out there, and I know we're not near the end. But do you have on your website? Do you have any of these resources out there? Do you have a resource or a particular location that coaches who just heard what you said create an uneven advantage who could go with a trusted source? Do you have somewhere that coaches who are listening right now thinking, oh, I want to try this next week or tomorrow in my session? Do you have any suggestions about where they can find that?
I sure do. It's YouTube, and just type in small-sided games and neutral players.
Cool.
Or go to my website, 3wsfundamentelsoccer.com, ask me that question, and I'll try to directly get the answer to you.
Perfect. Yeah, I tend to forget to kind of, and that's kind of my new goal is to make sure that I'm helping, or we're trying to help along coaches who are listening to this stuff and figuring out, all right, I heard this great podcast and I heard all this great content. Now, how in the world do I go and implement this, right? So I knew that you had some great resources, and I knew that that there likely would be some others out there. And obviously YouTube, we won't get into whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Social media is kind of taken over, and I think that my only suggestion, and again, God, what's up with the side notes today? Is that our favorite term? Side note this, side note that. But I've got a side note again for you. But my side note on YouTube is this. From experience and from watching others succeed and fail by using it, and from my own personal challenges in using it as well and trying to get ideas, it's wonderful. It's wonderful from a content. It's come a long way. The content is a lot better now than it used to be. Here's my only suggestion, and how I would caution those that are wanting to dive into YouTube and be the next professional coach out there at the U8 level. Remember, when you watch Man City train and you watch training sessions with the English FA on YouTube, you need to remember those are professional athletes playing at a very, very high level, and you have to be able, through either further educating yourself or through just, not to be harsh, maybe common sense to a certain extent, right? But we have to be able to tear it down. And I find that YouTube is powerful. YouTube is amazing. The content is out of this world now. But just please do not forget, for those that are listening, take what you see and apply that to the skill level and the team, maybe the age, but predominantly the skill level of the players you're working with. It won't work if you put your U12 team, second division, first division, any division, but your U12 team through a professional Premier League training session, right? It's just, there are going to be elements that don't work. It's not that it's, does that make sense, Karl? I mean, I've just seen this, and we wonder why when we see a phenomenal session, we have a phenomenal session plan. I talk to buddies all the time that are coaching as well, and we talk about, I've got this great plan, I've got this great session plan for tonight, and then we talk the next day, and hey, how'd the session go? It was an utter disaster. And then when you get to dive into it, it's because they were asking their players to do something from the skill or technique standpoint they never possessed to begin with. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense to me, and like I mentioned earlier, you have to adjust your practice sessions according to the skill level of your players. And obviously, professional training sessions don't fit into the youth. It might with some, I don't know. But again, it goes back to, if it works for you, then it's right. If it doesn't work, then figure out some way to adjust it.
Yeah.
But the reason that I use YouTube is because I think it's very important for coaches to see the movement or the actions of the players. Where if you read a book, a lot of times what happens is you put your own ideas into it, and if it doesn't work, it's tossed aside.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing here, if it doesn't work again, figure out some way to adjust it. I've seen too many clinicians who run a session and they don't know how to make it simpler. And what they do is they blame the players for not being able to do whatever they're trying to demonstrate.
Yep.
To me, the key of a good clinician is being able to find a way to get these players to be successful.
Yes, I love
How
that.
do you do it?
Yeah.
You simplify.
I love that.
Simplification can be done even with these professional teams' activities, as long as, again, 2 goals. If it's not toward 2 goals, I just don't believe that it's good for our American kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that you touched on something that I won't necessarily add too much to, just because we won't want to beat a dead horse here. But I think that we have to sacrifice and check our egos too when we bring that session that we think is the best session we've ever planned in our life, no matter where you found it or how you thought about it, right? And it's just going wrong. We have to be willing to change it. We have to be willing on the spot as coaches, as the leadership, as the teacher, the educator of that particular set of children. We have to be able to change that. Sacrificing our ego, leaving that at the door, but making sure that if it's not working, tweak it, change it, whether it's creating more of an uneven balance as we look at small-sided games, whether if you started with 4v2 or 4+2, maybe that's not the right place to start, right? So again, just to add on to that, it's to check the egos a little bit. I'm not talking because I've been there, I've done that, and I'm only coming at it from personal experience, personal failure, if you will, personal challenges. So I don't want to sound like I know everything or am that type of coach, but I've experienced that same thing. We've got to check our egos a little bit. If it's not working, just fix it, because kids are going to learn. If they're being successful, they're going to learn. If they're being not successful, obviously the learning pretty much stops there. Well, it doesn't stop, but you know what I'm saying.
Tyler, I just hope that your listeners understand that we don't know it all either.
Yeah.
It's a matter of them observing. I mean, to me, the coach's biggest job is to make sure that they use their eyes, observe to see what's happening with their players, and then make proper adjustments to make sure they succeed.
Right.
So we don't have all the answers, but the coach needs to make sure that the environment that they're playing in is adjusted accordingly to the skill level.
Right.
So let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is the size of the field. We already said that the goals themselves are the 10, larger team, 10 yards apart per player, larger player. Mm-hmm. So if we're playing 4 players against 2, it's 40 yards. But now the size of the field makes a difference also, and the size has to do with, again, the theme.
Right,
If it's an attacking theme and the players are weak, then you need a larger field. If it's a defending theme and the players are weak, then you need a narrower field. So the coach does have to make adjustment according to what they see and what their players are capable of doing. The adjustments of the field, by the way, also means variation, because if they have a larger field, more space to play in, they can try more things. As the field narrows down, now things get a little bit more difficult, and as things become more difficult, there's your variation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, larger field, smaller field. The number of opponents we talked about. If it's passing, make sure it's a uneven-sided game. Mm-hmm. All the other techniques, it's an even-sided game.
Right. And obviously, with the technical strength of the players, you're also making coaching decisions based on that in preparation. Correct?
Well, again, you've got the plus side where you're checking out if the player actually is able to do it. Mm-hmm. In the plus side is when you make your adjustments, because once you get to the versus game, now the test is coming up and you know they're going to fail if they're weak. So
right.
Make sure that you use the plus game as a very appropriate one and make the adjustments at that time. It could be kinesiology, right? You literally take the player's foot and adjust it to be in a certain position in order to do a good pass or to do a good shot on goal.
Brings us to the end of part 1 of a 2-part series with Coach Karl Dawazian. And let me tell you, if you've just listened to that, you probably, like I, am questioning everything that you've seen in the past few weeks on a soccer field potentially. But other than that, you hopefully have been left with some really absolutely top-notch, phenomenal ideas, philosophies, and questions to take to the next training session, and hopefully also a couple different games. We don't say drills here with Coach Karl on the episode. I know better than that, but in reality, you have some new games to take out to your players to encourage player development, to encourage fun, and to encourage player creativity through the use of small-sided games. Now, I will tell you, I have a sneak peek into next week, and I guarantee it's going to be worth your time to tune back in to the second part of Karl Dawazian's deeper, more detailed look into small-sided games. Now, again, if you did not catch on during the show and during the episode, and you have yet to check out Coach Karl's website, www.fundamentalsoccer.com. Obviously, he's got some great books, some paid resources, which, again, are extremely affordable. I must say I own not only the Fundamental Soccer 9-step practice routine, but also the Fundamental Soccer goalkeeping manual as well. They are some phenomenal books with some really great graphics, and to be honest, it's one of those things that you do want on your bookshelf as a coach who is looking to try to always grow, evolve, and be the best version of yourself that you possibly can. The bottom line is, if you're not into the paid resources, I know for a fact, and I speak probably on behalf of Coach Karl, just check out the free resources on his website. He absolutely does a top-notch job, again, of writing some really wonderful blogs, diving really deep into the relevant content that we are all facing right now in today's challenges as coaches. Make sure you check out his website, 3 W's, as he says it, fundamentalsoccer.com. Come back next week. We would love to have you to the second part of this little mini-series with Coach Karl Dawazian covering small-sided games, and we will see you next week.